Good evening. My name is Paul Mayhew, and I am the co-host for IGE Talks. My other partner, Renee, will be here shortly. Today, we have a great conversation for you, the audience out there, the public. We're going to talk about the Ebola virus. And we have a professional here, epidemiologist, that will help us and guide us in our discussions, and we have to research this issue the best that we could. And so we want to bring this to you because Ebola is a topic of the day. It's an order of the day, and so that's where we are. So why don't we go around and just kind of introduce each other right now, and I'll start over there to my far left.
I'm Chester Lowe. I'm one of the board members of Institute for Global Education and, of course, producer of the talk show.
Okay, Mike Franz. I'm also a IGE board member, and I wear a lot of different hats in the community, none of them connected to the topic tonight. So I'm here to learn maybe more than I can share, but I do know some things.
And again, I'm Paul Mayhew, and I do represent the group Voices Not Heard in Michigan, but we have, go ahead here.
I'm Brian Hartl. I'm an epidemiologist at the Kent County Health Department.
And I'm Jim Sullivan.
Right now, why don't we start off with having our epidemiologist give us a working definition of what Ebola is.
Okay. Ebola, we talk about Ebola as Ebola virus disease, and it's a disease caused by the Ebola virus, and it causes very serious disease. I think we talk about diseases that we typically see in the United States, and sometimes the mortality rates or the number of people who die from those infections are not very high. But when you're talking Ebola, the scariest thing about it is the fact that almost 50% of people who are infected with Ebola end up dying from the virus. So Ebola, it's a viral hemorrhagic fever. It causes, the first symptoms that it causes are very similar to the flu: headache, fever, body ache, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea. But it's very serious forms of that, and it progresses. You can start with a fever, then start getting some of the other symptoms, and then it rapidly progresses to very serious infection and disease. So it's quite a scary thing. And obviously, earlier in the year, the outbreak in Africa, the 3 countries in Africa started. And I think it's one of those things that was out there. It was across the ocean. Not many people in the United States really paid much attention to it. Even in public health, I think that we were kind of looking at it and keeping our eyes on it, but thinking that this is probably something that we're not going to have to deal with. But as soon as the cases started piling up in Africa, and that the first case showed up in Dallas, as you mentioned, that really brought it to the United States and changed the way we viewed Ebola.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you give us a timeline on how the disease progresses and the incubation period in this?
That's a good question. We'll first start with how the virus is transmitted. I think that's kind of what's talked about a lot on the news. We have certain types of viruses that are airborne transmission, so they kind of float in the air, and you can be in the same room with someone or sit next to someone talking, and that you can transmit infection like that. We have viruses that are spread through droplet, so like sneezes, like small droplet and like small droplets of oral secretions, and they can only travel short distances, like within 3 feet of each other. Ebola, while it can be transmitted through droplet spread, like through bodily fluids, saliva, blood, other types of bodily fluids, it really takes a direct contact with blood or body fluids of a person who's sick with Ebola. So you can't transmit Ebola virus before those symptoms start. You have to have really close contact with the blood or body fluids of someone who's sick with Ebola. And you always hear on the news this 21-day period after which someone's exposed to Ebola. You have to wait that 21 day. That's our incubation period that you mentioned. So Ebola symptoms will show up anywhere from 2 to 21 days after someone's exposed to the virus. And typically, on average, it's about 8 to 10 days for the symptoms to start. But we, take that out to 21 days just to make sure that person is cleared. So all the contacts of the cases in Dallas, they're all monitored for 21 days.
Is that similar to other flu viruses?
No, it's quite a long incubation period. Flu
Ah.
virus is only about 1 to 4 days of incubation period. Most bacterias like E. coli or Salmonella, those are about 72 hours. So it's quite a long incubation period that we look for with Ebola.
And how long does a person live or die with the disease? How its progression?
If you don't get good care for Ebola, if you're not treated in the hospital, it doesn't take long. It's one of those things where the symptoms progress rapidly, and your body just shuts down, your organs shut down, and the bleeding and the bruising. That's what really causes the demise of people is the internal bleeding, and you just start bleeding out basically. So within a week or so, those people, from the onset of symptoms, if they don't get care, they can die pretty quickly.
I got a lot of questions. Is it
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
You do, that's good.
How would you compare this to the plague?
Oh, the plague. That's a good question. I don't, obviously the plague was.
That would be the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
I understand.
I think the difference between this and something like the plague is how easily it's transmitted. I think people are concerned about Ebola becoming a big outbreak in the United States, and you see it happening in Africa, and it's like 13,000 cases, in the 3 countries in Africa. So I think people get concerned that people are just going to be walking around the United States and transmitting this virus to people who walk by them. But really, Ebola it's a very difficult virus, to cause big outbreaks like that, especially in a developed country like the United States. As I mentioned before, it takes someone who is sick with the symptoms of Ebola to transmit it. It takes very close contact, to be able to transmit the virus from person to person. And once even if you have symptoms like you just have a fever, like those nurses, or that one nurse that flew on the plane, at that point the virus load, we call it, in your body is very low. And as you progress and you become more symptomatic and more sick, then the virus becomes more present in your bloodstream. So you're more likely to transmit the virus at that point. So once someone's, at the point where they can easily transmit someone through that close contact, they're very, very sick, and they're probably not going to be out walking around. They're going to be in the hospital fighting for their life. So it's one of those things where I kind of expect a few cases to pop up here and there, but as we've seen with people traveling on aircraft, close contacts of the case in Dallas, we have 4 cases in the United States, and if it were more easily transmittable like the plague or something that's easily transmitted person to person, we would see a lot more of these contacts having Ebola.
So it's more than 2, I thought it was only 2 cases, but 4 cases, huh?
We have 4 cases, or we've had 4 cases. We've had, the individual who came from Liberia to Dallas, the first case, the 2 nurses that were in close contact with him, and then the doctor in New York, returned from Guinea.
Oh,
But he was healed though, wasn't he?
I don't know.
I mean, the doctor in New York, didn't he?
I haven't heard about him yet. I know the 2 nurses have been healed and cured.
What happens if a person is resistant to treatment? Is there any way that you can compel a person to be treated, in terms of medical treatment?
That's an excellent question, and we've had a lot of discussion locally about how we would respond to a case of Ebola if someone shows up at one of our hospitals. The thing with, obviously we want to contain it. We want to make sure that it's contained, and we have talked, as a public health department, we have public health powers where we can basically require someone to be isolated or quarantined with a highly communicable disease. We determine them as a health threat to others. So we work closely with our corporate counsel at the County of Kent to look through the public health code and identify ways that we can work with our judges to get these orders to be served to individuals who may be resistant to staying in the hospital, or maybe resistant to stay in a quarantine situation to help protect others from becoming ill.
So you're talking about the threshold of danger to self and others?
Correct, yeah. Yeah, so there's something in the public health code public health code called health threat to others. And if those individuals aren't cooperating with the precautions in place to keep them contained, to limit their exposure to other people, we can step in and get a judge's order to basically force them to stay in isolation and quarantine.
I have a question.
Other questions?
What's different about Africa that has allowed it to spread so easily there as compared to here?
There's a lot of things. First of all, the healthcare system is not very well developed, and then you see on the news where they're treating these individuals are intense and things like that. Whereas the CDC or Emory and the National Institutes of Health, they have these specific hospital. Basically it's like 4 hospital rooms combined to treat one patient. So that's a big thing. It's just the healthcare system and the infrastructure for healthcare there. Another thing is there's their practices. When someone dies, there's different cultural practices where people are touching the body and doing different things like that. And that's a big risk factor for Ebola. I think that's what occurred. The very first cases occurred after funeral rites for an individual who had died from Ebola, and those individuals were at the funeral. Then became symptomatic and had Ebola. And then finally, just the environment in which people live. A lot of people don't have running water. They can't wash their hands. If someone gets sick in their household, they don't have proper precautions to clean it up or even wash their hands. I think they don't have TVs, and you see pictures like they have billboards up, about stop Ebola. This is what to look for. But you're absolutely right. They might not know what's going on. They might not know the precautionary preventive measures to take in order to protect themselves if a family member becomes sick.
Well, let me intervene here a little bit, because I was in Senegal a few years ago, at least in 1995. It was pretty modern at that point in time. Senegal was a modern city, and a lot of the cities are pretty modern now. There was a portion of the community that was, what do you say, out in the bushes, But in terms of the cities, there was TV, there was running water, stuff like that. Now, we had to be careful of the water because there was what they call river blindness and stuff like that. And the waters, it was highly, what they say, highly infectious. But in terms of, they had hospitals and, so there are hospitals. I don't think we can just look at Africa as totally archaic and without any type of decent infrastructure. There is still the bushes, but then there is modern Africa as well, So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to paint a picture of all of Africa, but the countries where it's occurring, they do have some underdeveloped areas. And I think you bring up a good point, because there was one case that came to Senegal.
Right.
And there was one case, and it came to the developed area of that country. And so it was contained, there was only one case, there was no transmission to other individuals who cared for that case. But I was watching a seminar out of Johns Hopkins, and they indicated if that case had gone to some of the poorer areas of Senegal, it would have been a much different situation, because they wouldn't have been cared for in a hospital situation where they were prepared for something like that. So.
What about the hemorrhagic portion of this? There's like 4 different types of hemorrhagic types of things. Are they related in some type of way, or are they mutated, or is their genesis similar in the originality? Because in doing our research, we traced it back to the 60s and connected it with the Marburg disease.
What is it? What is Marburg? What is it?
That's what you and he going to answer in a few minutes. Oh. And then we also have our co-host here. I better introduce her. That's Renee. She's here too, and she's got a lot of information as well. So, but anyway, I'm trying to figure out, the genesis of this situation. And according to that particular research that we talked about, it was talked about that it was in food that was cooked, meats, that people might have ingested at that time. They talked about pigs. They talked about monkeys. That's what was said. Now I wanted to say that in front of the epidemiologist so he could screw my head on right if we're wrong.
So there are 5 different types of Ebola virus.
Okay.
There's the
Oh,
one that's,
wow.
what's that?
5?
5 different types, and it's all in the same family of viruses, so they're all very similar viruses, different strains. This is the one that's causing the current outbreak is called the Zaire Ebola virus. And so these 5 Ebola viruses are in the same family as the Marburg virus, and they're all viral hemorrhagic fevers. Okay, so the history of Marburg virus, as you mentioned, in 1967, there was some individuals, some laboratory workers in Europe who were doing some laboratory research with African monkeys. So in the handling of the tissue from the monkeys, that's what caused them to become infected with Marburg virus. And Ebola and Marburg virus are very similar in what we call the reservoir, where the virus kind of lives typically. Fruit bats are a big reservoir for Ebola and Marburg virus, and then primates can also be infected with Ebola and Marburg viruses, and that's where the situation with we call it bushmeat. So people who go, hunt monkeys, hunt, other primates, and then eat them. That's when these viruses can be introduced into the human population. Because typically they're not, in the human population, they're not typically transmitted person to person. The reservoirs are the bats or the primates, and then either through exposure with the bats or eating the bushmeat, they call it. That's when it gets introduced into the human
There's
population.
one theory that the HIV virus got started in contact with green monkeys.
Yeah, that's another theory about where HIV
A
came
theory.
from. Yeah.
Not a reality, but a theory.
And there's other theories too that are
But the bushmeat
more
is
insidious.
really interesting because, I'm just going back to my time in Senegal, and, in the square, they would slaughter goats, and you could eat the goats, fresh goats, and slaughter the goats right out in the square and barbecue them. But the other real interesting thing is there were bush people that came to the city to sell their wares. And then you mentioned the potential for the bush meat eating people to potentially carry it. So in Senegal at that time, I saw people that were from the bush that was in the square and selling their wares, and that brings up an interesting paradigm there in terms of how this stuff could possibly be spread.
And
Especially
you didn't mention community water supplies and that can become contaminated, but isn't that a big source of it too?
Actually, Ebola is not transmitted via water.
So somebody with diarrhea, if they threw his fluids into the
We
drinking
don't-
water
don't
stream
mention
or
that.
whatever.
Yeah, we've actually talked to the Grand Rapids City water system here to how we would handle a case of Ebola here, because
Yeah.
in Dallas, there were situations where the water companies didn't want them to flush waste from the Ebola patients into the city's system. They would have to, put bleach and dump bleach into the toilets or sinks, after they disposed of that waste. In Grand Rapids, they talked about it's fine, it can be flushed and it will become diluted in the water system, and there's no risk of transmission via water.
Well,
It actually had occurred in Frankfurt, Marburg, Germany, and as well as in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. Yeah, so at that time, 31 people were ill, just 31, including the several people involved in the medical lab working on it. Yeah, so that was the first case.
Go ahead, Jim.
You had talked about how the bush people eat primates. Are they immune to the Ebola virus?
The bush people immune to it, if they survive after becoming infected. I think that's a good point, and when we see some of these individuals who have survived Ebola in this current outbreak, they're utilizing their serum to treat other people, so they've got antibodies in their blood stream that can be used to help treat other patients. So I know one of the doctors that returned from West Africa and was cured here in the United States, his serum and antibodies were used to treat some of the patients who were treated in the United States. So everybody's body is different. There could be individuals who, for some reason, developed immunity, maybe a low dose or something like that. I don't know all the details of that. But that's just, you know, how your immune system works. If you've been exposed once and survived it, you know, then you've got protection against secondary infection of the virus.
Is that the primary way to treat it, is by using somebody else's serum?
You know, there's really no specific treatment for Ebola. Like, there's no drugs that are, you know, targeted. It's mostly supportive treatment through fluids and other, you know, measures that, you know, just help the body recover, but there's no specific treatments for it. But, you know, they use these experimentally to, you know, infuse, do blood transfusions with these individuals to provide them with those antibodies to help fight off the virus.
Which raises another interesting point too. The big pharma companies weren't interested at all in dealing with vaccines for this disease because they thought it was going to be so contained that there wouldn't be enough profit in it. And all of a sudden now I understand there's starting to
Big
work on
Pharma
it.
is probably busting heads to try to get to the top of the heap right now.
Well, probably not, because it hasn't actually spread to the point where they could make money, big money off it, which is what.
Well, the scare tactic is where, see, in politics, and I hate to do that, but in politics, it's a scare tactic that drives the cost.
Oh, yeah.
So now we have a scare, which will drive costs, which would help to create, you know, a product that can be sold on the market to say this will prevent you from catching it,
Which is profitable.
which is profitable. So that's as American as apple pie.
Well, yeah, the HIV, they developed drugs to treat that, and eventually, it took a long time, they did get to Africa with the strong support from the richer countries like the United States. And they got drugs there that were available here that weren't available there.
I think they had some in Germany as well as in Great Britain.
Communities now have resorted to using biosolids as fertilizer. Now, I'm concerned, when I was on the commission, I was very concerned about biosolids being used as fertilizer because of the vectors.
Yeah.
So am I on the right track? Am I on the wrong track? What's happening? And can you explain all that stuff that I threw at you?
Yeah, I can try. You know, the biosolids, you'll have to educate me a little bit more about that, because I don't know exactly what they use to put in those biosolids. But as you mentioned, a vector, I think that's the most important word that you use is vector. So dengue and chikungunya, which you've probably heard now, is another emerging disease. West Nile virus are all vector-borne diseases. So these are diseases that can't be transmitted directly from a person to another person. There needs to be some sort of vector that takes the virus or the infectious organism from one person into another. So mosquitoes are the main vector for all those cases. So similar transmission for those, dengue fever, malaria, West Nile virus. West Nile virus is the one that we've seen mostly here in the United States. In Michigan, 2012 was a big year for West Nile virus. In Michigan, we had 40-some cases here in Kent County. Because of the weather that year, the weather was very hot, very dry, and the mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus thrive in those types of environments.
So there's no inverse connection to Ebola that could come from those particular vectors.
No, it's not transmitted from that way.
Okay.
But I know if you've traveled to those countries and then, as I've done, gone down into the Caribbean, and, you know, I come back and I want to donate blood, they say, have you been to, and they mention it for a place that, well, yeah, we touched our port here. They said, well, I wasn't allowed to give for a year or more. Seems to be a year, 2 years. I mean, it's like I was carrying an infection inside me, or potentially.
Yeah, it's because, you know, those types of viruses, arboviruses we call them, you can be infected but not know it. So because a lot of those viruses cause asymptomatic or subclinical disease, you can maybe have just a fever. So like I think 20% of, like 80% of those who have an infection with one of those viruses are asymptomatic. 20% will get a fever, call it West Nile fever or arboviral fever, and then like a small percentage will have like more serious disease called neuroinvasive disease. You talked about central nervous system, Chester. So those types of viruses can cause meningitis and encephalitis and things like that. So the fact that you may have been infected, and if you provide your blood and someone else gets that blood that's infected with those viruses, it could impact their health. So that's why.
Are there any long-term effects from Ebola?
From Ebola?
Infections, yeah. From, you know, amongst the survivors?
I don't know that.
You know, liver disease or some cirrhosis or something?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, it seems like most of the people I've known of that have survived, there's just a few in the United States, they seem to be okay, but long-term effects may be different. I just don't know.
I have a couple of unrelated questions.
Oh.
The first one, because I'm not real sure what your knowledge is on this area, so I just put it out there.
Okay.
Is I've heard things about the possibility that climate change may be having an impact on some of the natural ways that viruses and things get killed off. I'm wondering if you're aware of any research in that area, if climate change is a factor. And I'll pause and let you do that, because the other one's totally unrelated.
Okay. I don't, obviously climate change has an impact on the vectors that we see, in this area. Typically, certain forms of mosquitoes, certain forms of ticks and things like that, live in certain parts of the country where the climate is perfect for them. And what we've seen is a kind of expansion of those habitats, for some vectors. Ticks have kind of exploded. We've had a lot more ticks, and Lyme disease is becoming more common in Michigan, whereas before Lyme disease was, kind of an East Coast thing in other parts of the country. But we've seen the lake shores kind of where it started, and then the expansion of tick habitats, to the inland areas of Michigan. So we're seeing more Lyme disease. So that's one thing that I can, talk about. When I talked about the hot weather a couple of years ago in 2012 with the mosquitoes, we know that the virus, West Nile virus in mosquitoes, duplicates or replicates more rapidly in warmer temperatures. So I'm sure that's similar to other, vectors, or reservoirs where the virus may be quicker to replicate and have higher viral loads, and therefore be more easily transmitted because of those environments. So I'm not an expert on climate change, but those are some of the things that in public health that we think about in terms of how disease impacts populations.
And then, so my other question is, what are you aware of in terms of the international response in Africa? How are we doing? Are we behind schedule? What needs to happen now? And then, we hear about this popping up every now and then. What maybe can we start doing on a long-term basis to prevent outbreaks from happening again?
That's a very good question. To answer the first question about what, the global response to it, I know that the webinar that I saw from Johns Hopkins a couple of weeks ago showed that the response is, in terms of money and resources, is not where it needs to be to fight this off appropriately. It's interesting to see the countries that have donated the most money, to the effort. The United States is obviously at the top, and some of the other countries are actually surpassed by foundations like the Gates Foundation and other foundations that have actually given more money to the effort than some entire countries have. And so, obviously, when we look at the human side of things, I think things like policies that are put in place, like the mandatory quarantine policy that New Jersey, put into place, things like that, where healthcare workers might be less inclined to go if they know that they're coming back to the United States and will be quarantined for 21 days and they can't, go anywhere. So, so obviously we need to do everything we can to, allow these, humanitarian workers to get there, to give them the resources that they need, and then to not stigmatize them when they come back to the United States. I think, every little bit, makes a difference as to, what motivates someone to go, and whether or not they will go to do this, extremely difficult work that is needed in that part of the world.
So Fred Upton's advice that we just completely shut down everything is not really going to fly in terms of tackling this.
Yeah, no, I think that's, CDC stands by that. That's probably one of the worst things that we can do for this.
Why would you have said that?
What's that?
Why would you have said that?
Well, I think people think that, shutting down, like, it's all about the United States, it's all about what happens in this country. So in order to, we have people, the only cases that have occurred in the United States are from people who've been exposed to either West African countries or exposed to someone from a West African country. We have two aid workers, or one person from Liberia, one doctor from Guinea, and then the two nurses that took care of the patient in Dallas. So shutting down the borders, restricting or eliminating all travel from those countries is how they think, we're gonna stop this from happening in the United States. But the thing is that people can come in from other routes, and by allowing people to come in and out of the country freely, you have the aid workers that can still go there and return, as well as you can do a better job of tracking individuals who return from those countries, because the CDC has recently put in place a policy that anyone coming from those 3 countries is directed through 5 airports in the United States, and they're monitored for fever. They're given a packet about Ebola, about what to do, monitor their symptoms, take their temperature twice a day. And then local health departments, we get notification of people in our jurisdiction who have returned from those areas. So we follow them up, we call them twice a day, make sure that they're monitoring their temperature, tell them what to do if they become symptomatic with Ebola. We follow them for the 21-day period. And we have 2 travelers currently that are here now that we're following. Very low risk travelers, they didn't have contact with Ebola cases, they didn't, they weren't healthcare workers. So that just gives us as public health a way to control what's going on here, as opposed to shutting down the borders completely and having people come here that we just don't know about.
I think also Spectrum Health, who has taken a bull by the horn and began to do training for how you dress and prepare for it, because what happened in that Dallas ER room had a lot of connotations to it, especially for African Americans in the community. Because historically, and as a clinician that had worked and dealt with trying to fix the whole ER problem, ER is used by the poor as a major treatment. So what happens is you get people in the ER situation that will see a person come in and say, oh, I kind of dismiss that person. That seems to be what had happened in Texas. The guy came in, he says, I've been to West Africa. He disclosed what happened to him, but then he was dismissed, seemingly to me, in my untrained, I ain't that untrained, but in my untrained thought, he was kind of dismissed, sent back home. We were sitting on TV and we were wondering, when are they going to go to that person's house and clean up that house? Well, that didn't happen until a week or so afterward, which was odd, So you got all of this going on, and so you look like it's a bill breach in treatment at the ER. And so now America has to grapple with its treatment of other people at the ER. You have to grapple with the fact that when a person comes in to the ER now, you have to give them a thorough exam. You have to do more than an active listening response to them in what they're saying, because historically, that's what you get at the ER, is active listening response. Nobody really paying attention to what you say. Well, I can't say nobody, but the attention span of paying attention to what people were saying was small. But now you've got to have those ears on. You got to have your listening ears on. You got to understand what that person is talking about. So I think that's going to be paramount, because that's the front door of this stuff. The ER is the front door.
Can we talk about what goes on inside the hospital? You may or may not like what I'm about to say, but I just read a book called Unaccountable. It talks about the unaccountability of what's going on in our hospitals and by direct treatments by physicians. And about 1 out of 4 contacts results in malpractice. I mean, they just make mistake after mistake. And in the process of this book, there's one section where he dealt with what the hospitals cover up a lot and fear most. And one of the things they feared most was people falling. But even more so than that was the spread of infectious disease.
Correct.
And they can hardly keep that under control. They had people who were supposed to be washing their hands, and they only had like 40% compliance. They put in cameras, and all of a sudden people started washing, they had 90% compliance, but not perfect. Okay, and you know, if you're treating hands-on patient kinds of things, doctors walk into the room, they're busy, they go over and touch the patient, and a nurse says, "Doctor, you didn't wash your hands." You know, they've got to have a comfortable kind of feeling there where a subordinate can tell somebody who's higher up, you know, or remind them of something, you know. And hospitals are hierarchical; they tend to go the other direction. You know, I think we should be very suspicious of any hospital that claims if we have an Ebola outbreak, we can control it. I think we're in deep doo-doo. You know, well, that might be appropriate.
Well, I think the attention that is being paid to it now, and the hyper awareness now, I think that's going to help us in terms of controlling the spread of Ebola. The hyper attention that we're paying to this now, because now at this point, especially after Texas, you know, we're not going to be as dismissive to people coming into the ER, you know, saying I just got a headache.
Yeah.
You know, now, okay, where you been? What you eat? You know, all this stuff is going to come into play, which is going to make a more thorough type of treatment in the ER.
You know, this has been something they've been trying to show through shows on TV in the last decade, if not 2 decades. And there are certain shows of physicians and nurses doing things out of line, and then finding out later that the results are so negative that it takes people's lives, as well as affects other people's lives as well.
Yeah.
And I can say the name of the show, but I don't know if that would be okay to say, not like House.
Oh, yeah.
And then there
Very popular program.
Yeah.
right, we had ER, we had a number of other shows having to do with the medical field that were indicating this very thing.
Yeah.
We even had the movie called Philadelphia. I don't know if you remember that one or not, with Denzel Washington
Oh yeah.
and
Kind of vague.
Tom Hanks.
Tom Hanks. Yeah.
All about people wanting to all of a sudden become sanitized because of what was considered as AIDS spreadable or contagiousness.
So
Well, really, it was something that was not, they weren't sure.
Yeah.
But because of the non-familiarity, they became very.
But I think the Ebola has created a hypersensitiveness that's beyond the spread of AIDS. You know, AIDS when it hit created a hypersensitive, but because of the imminent death of Ebola, AIDS, they quickly developed cocktails. They developed the AZT.
Right.
And so the doctors and the pharmaceutical companies profited real good from it. But anyway, so they, you know, but I think that the Ebola, you know, in the way that it can knock you out and kill you at a head drops notice, you know, that hypersensitiveness is going to remain and is going to drive treatment for a long time in America.
Before you go further, can I ask Hartl and Jimmy, what a cocktail is that he's referring to?
What a cocktail, I don't think it's the cocktail that you're kind of thinking of.
That's why I'm asking.
It's a mixture.
It's a combination of drugs, basically, that will impact that.
Some people don't know that.
Yeah, right. So it's
Right.
Not that clear.
Oh,
a combination of drugs that they give to patients. Yeah.
And
that people don't realize, we don't know enough about Africa, but it's a big continent.
It's
Some
a
people think it's a
huge
country,
continent.
and I saw a T-shirt today that said Africa, or it did say Africa. It showed the continent of Africa, and it said Asia below it. It was one of these jokes, you know, that people are so ignorant they think that was Asia or Africa. What do we know? You know?
I saw a map that put America and everybody, China, and everybody on the continent of Africa, and there was still space left. So Africa is that big.
Oh, yeah.
So But while I got the floor, we should begin to wrap up, you know? And so, because I think we've had a great discussion, and so I think we should begin to wrap up, and so it'll probably take us about 5 or 6 minutes to wrap up.
Well, as we
Let's
go
do
about
that.
wrapping up, I did want to put something out there having to do with the European countries, particularly Russia. I did some research and found that Russia was using the Marburg and Frankfurt virus as
Weapons.
weapon.
Oh, sure.
Are you familiar with it? Yeah,
I'm
so
not,
people-
but I can understand that that's probably, they were attempting to them. I mean, a lot of these, infections that cause serious, disease have been looked at as bioterrorism agents, so.
Oh, that's nasty.
But
Have you
can,
been trained in that in Grand Rapids here?
We have, bioterrorism preparedness, we have emergency preparedness coordinator at the health department, we have emergency management at the county level with law enforcement and first responders that, work towards planning and preparedness in response to bioterrorism events, smallpox, anthrax, things like that. So, but the majority of stuff we deal with is stuff that happens on a day-to-day basis, foodborne illnesses and things like that.
Legionnaire disease.
Yeah, stuff like that. So, but you're right. I mean, anytime, back in the, well, obviously you're still in wartime, but they look into things that can be used as bio agents against their
I
enemies.
think it's Russia and Ukraine both that has that type of situation going on. Now, whether it'll affect people who come over here, I don't know, but I've read about that and I've heard people even talk about that. And I'm wondering whether or not it's even being discussed or spoken about on the media, that is on the
I haven't seen much of that.
main
I think,
channels.
I think that when you look at certain viruses or bacteria that can become weaponized, some of these things that we talked about with Ebola makes it not that easily weaponized. Something like smallpox, where it can infect a lot of people with a small dose. That's the type of agent that you can weaponize easily and make it a bioterrorism agent. But Ebola is not something that is easily, or Marburg even, that's easily transmitted. If you can, tweak the virus to do that, then sure, it can become very serious. But
So like how the weapons were back in our 18 or 1700s when the soldiers were trying to act as though they were having peace among the Native American Indians
sure,
and giving them blankets with smallpox.
yeah, right. That's easily transmitted. So yeah.
Let's go to,
Well, to help
Yeah.
to wrap up a little bit. I wanted to get back to what you were talking about earlier with protocol in hospitals
yeah,
and how protocol so often, we hear stories of where it has failed. I'm wondering if our guest could talk about what kind of protocols are being considered, maybe changes, updates in light of Ebola, and what kinds of things does the health department do on a regular basis to ensure that protocols are being reevaluated, established, and
Sure, it's a great question. I think the thing with Ebola is it's always, it's emerging. We're always learning new things about it. And as unfortunate as it was in Dallas that happened, I think there was a lot learned from that. Even CDC changed their protocols for protective equipment that healthcare workers wear, ways that you funnel people through the ER, the questions that are asked, even emergency departments or primary care physicians and even specialty clinics now are asking people, have you had any travel to these 3 countries in Africa? So we're learning a lot every day, and at the hospital level, with the way that they respond, that they're training people in the ways to put on and take off that protective equipment. They have buddy systems in place to make sure that their partner is putting it on and taking it off properly and watching them do that. EMS providers who may come in contact, law enforcement providers who may come in contact with a case. Then in terms of us at the health department, we're mainly responsible for tracking individuals who are in contact with an Ebola patient or who have returned from West Africa, who have provided health care in West Africa. So those protocols, have just changed, like on the 27th of October, we got new protocols from the CDC to say who's a high-risk individual, who's, at some risk, who's a low risk, and how to deal with those, because, the situation in New York with the healthcare provider returning from Guinea, he's on the subway, and he was at a bowling alley, the day before he had symptoms. So now, those individuals who are determined high or some risk, they have controlled or restricted movement, or controlled movement we call it, so they're not supposed to go to social gatherings, they're not even supposed to go to work, they're not supposed to take public transportation or take an aircraft within that 21-day period. So we keep learning, this information based upon some mistakes that have been made. I think we'll continue to learn more and more about it. Hopefully we're in the position right now where we've got things mainly under control, learn from the mistakes that have happened, so something like that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and my kind of closing statement, you provoked a thought that if they're controlling the people that much, then who pays, if I'm gonna lose time off work like that, who pays me for taking off work? If I'm a family person and all of a sudden I'm ordered by the government to not move, then where's my salary gonna come from? If I can't move, so do I lose my home because I'm not getting income? Now that's the provocative question in America, because everything is based on income and money that you make. So if I'm told to stay home, not to go any place for 21 days, that's a 2-week check.
Yeah.
So have we figured out the logistics of that? Will the corporation or the company that they're working for, will the insurance companies cover that? That becomes the
The answer
question.
is probably no.
That becomes a question that the legislators are going to have to grapple with. And now, I don't know if we got a friendly, and I'm not going to prejudice anything that we got right now, and hopefully we got some sensitive legislators that'll look at this program and understand that gap needs to be filled. Because if I got to stay home, mandated by the government, 21 days, then I'm losing 21 days of income.
I thought they would have something like the insurance policies for when people are hospitalized.
Yeah,
They get
they
60%, I think it is.
They're going to be going up sky high.
Yeah,
You ain't going to be able to afford them.
I know.
Well,
Another
you know,
thing too, this came from public radio, they were discussing what happened with the Dallas nurses at the hospital, going back
Yeah, we
to
did have.
where you opened this discussion. The hospital said, well, we've got this thing controlled, we know how to deal with this. And the nurses went to the media and they said, no, we don't know how to deal with this infection. And they put a gag order on the nurses. They said, you will not talk to the media. And the nurses then went to their unions and told the unions, and the unions talked to the public about it. We can't allow that to happen if this things get out of hand, because the people inside the hospitals who are working with the disease know more about what's going on than some CEO sitting up in the,
And that's going to fire you for being truthful
Right.
about what's happening and trying to protect the public.
Right.
That's what the one nurse that came on, she was afraid that she's going to lose her job.
Yeah.
Well, somebody needs to step up to the mic and say, well, even if it's whistleblowers, somebody's got to protect that person, because the CEO who's trying to protect his income and trying to protect his hiney is going to say, hey, she went and talked out of line and we got to get her. And that's the American as apple pie too.
Something to be watched. I did hear a very encouraging report tonight again on public radio, WPPR. Some billionaire named one of the richest men in the world, I think his name is Zuckerman. He's, pardon?
Zuckerberg, the Facebook guy? Zuckerberg?
Zuckerberg, I keep thinking of Naked Gun, the Zuckerman wrote the script for. But okay, he's gone all out to contribute money to this. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that he wants to pour into it. And also they were talking about a Facebook thing that was being set up where people could go to Facebook and make donations directly to 3 different organizations. One of them I would recommend, my opinion, the Red Cross. But there were two other organizations, I think, where the money would actually get through. So Facebook may be the avenue that our people watching this program might want to use if they want to at some point.
Well, we're gonna go on and try to wrap this on up. I think we've had a great discussion
I agree.
and an excellent question, and we're really proud that the health department sent you around.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we're gonna thank the audience and thank IGE. And Chester, you probably have a commercial that you wanna know about?
No, not a commercial. I really want to say thanks to Papa John's.
Yes.
Thanks to the Mind Buzz Cafe,
All
who
right.
provide coffee, as well as Big B's. The local Big B's, which is at the corner of Fuller and Michigan, Northeast. So, and Mind Buzz, of course, is at, was it 260?
208.
208, excuse me, 208
Mark.
Granville,
Granville Drive.
yeah, Granville Southwest.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and hey, onward and upward, and I think the more we discuss this, the better we get.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.